Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Don Oscar El Coyote Villalobos Red Honey Processed Costa Rica from Apollon's Gold. And there's the bag right there. And Apollon's Gold, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And this is part one of a 4-part Apollon's Gold series that will feature a bonus Friday video, as well as a very special coffee on Saturday, so stay tuned for that. This is their 3rd ever appearance on this channel, having reviewed a couple of their coffees towards the end of last year. And the main reason for this series is the coffees that will be featured on Friday and Saturday. However, it did give us the opportunity to review a couple of their other coffees, so I'm looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 61. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. They do have a brew guide on the back of their bags, and it's very much in line with our standard recipe. So they do have between 93 and 97 degrees Celsius and 15 to 16 grams over 250 grams, which translates to a 15.625 to a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio. So we were pretty much in the middle of both of those ranges. Now, roast profile for this one's probably the most developed of the 4 coffees that we are going to be reviewing from them. However, even then, it's still very, very light by most standards and metrics, as Apollon's Gold is one of, if not the lightest roasting coffee roasters that we have reviewed on this channel. This coffee is very light. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 46, first impression, and the coffee immediately did start skewing on the more citric side of things. And one thing I must note for anybody that's wondering why we started on day 46, they do have on here on the back of the bag as well that you should start it after day 45. So they have a day 45 to day 70 window. So I did let this coffee rest all the way up to day 46, and this first impression definitely did lean a little bit more into the citric characteristics of the cup, as there was definitely a complexity underneath. I was getting a slight bit of the stone fruit aspect that they have listed on here, buried underneath what was a more citric forward cup. Plenty of brightness right from the onset, and a pretty decent start in general. Day 49, ran it through the Chemex, and the coffee was slightly more soft with a slight stone fruit sweetness, as the listed apricot that they had felt a little bit more apt, as it was slightly bright with a little bit less of the secondary citric characteristics to it. The cup does cool down into a much more citric cup. It's a good day on this day as well, but for the most part, still a pretty tame coffee. Day 51, ran it through the April dripper, and the cup just felt really light, and every part of this felt really light, between the flavor profile as well as the kind of texture, the body to the cup in general. It was quite reminiscent of previous Apollon's Gold experiences, the 2 that we have reviewed, and that was the biggest issue I had with both of those coffees, was that they came out so light and tame in general. So I was struggling with those coffees, and I was struggling with this one a little bit as well. The coffee does seem to have a slight red fruit aspect to it, but for the most part, it is pretty citric floral within the finish itself. Day 54, a slight bit of a finer grind, and there was a little bit more to the cup, so I would suggest maybe a slightly more fine grind to the cup. While it does remain moderately tame, it does have a bright stone fruit aspect in the finish on this day. Otherwise, it's continuously citric floral forward, as listed lime still continues to feel like the most pronounced component to this cup. I would say that that was the most dominant and distinct factor throughout the duration of drinking this coffee, was the lime at the forefront, probably the most noticeable and pronounced component within this coffee. Day 56, back through the Chemex, and I definitely opted for the V60 from this point going forward, as the Chemex really did just seem to mute what was already a pretty tame flavor to begin with. It was extremely delicate, to the point where I felt it was way too delicate for me, which is kind of a funny notion given that people know I prefer delicate coffees in general. This one felt way too delicate, even by my standards. A fair bit of brightness, a subtle stone fruit yet again, but continuously pretty tame, as there's a floral citric aspect at the forefront and very little to pick out outside from that. Day 58, attempted the V60 with higher temperatures, a more fine grind, and I was able to pull out a little bit more from this cup, as there was a citric aspect in a slightly more pronounced manner, very much in line with the lime that we've had to this point, but this felt maybe a slight bit more defined. So I wanted to say that the coffee was improving with time, that you're getting more vibrancy from the cup. Here on day 61, that's still not necessarily the case, as the coffee continues to remain pretty soft, pretty tame, pretty delicate, and I'm not able to pull out too many things, with the exception of what is a very citric aspect to the cup in a kind of complementary floral sense with it as well. So just pretty bright in general, not pulling out too much on that day or this day either, with the exception of a very defined citric component. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness at a level 4. And one thing I do have to say is this is a red honey processed coffee, but you could have fooled me because this coffee is very clean. It very much acts like a wash processed coffee, and throughout the entirety of drinking it, there was nothing that kind of took away from that. By every standard, I could definitely say that this was a level 4 in terms of the cleanliness. They did a great job of the clarity. Again, for me, it just acted like a wash processed coffee. Finish, level 4. Yes, and that is attributed to the citric component that's in it, but I think you need to take this entire tasting wheel in kind of context, because all of these things, they're relative to this coffee, because none of them are an overly pronounced component within it. So we'll discuss that a little bit more, but even the finish being there at that level 4, it's kind of relative to the way the rest of the coffee was. Definitely a little bit more on the citric side of things. Acidity, level 4. As I kind of mentioned, these coffees are very light. They're very lightly roasted, so you are going to experience a fair bit of brightness to them. This one was no exception, definitely a fair bit of the acidity within the cup, and it's not something I mentioned too often, and I think it's because it was just kind of present within all of the coffees that we have reviewed from them. Florality, level 4. Yes, right there in line with the citric component, and I didn't necessarily have a great defining floral aspect that I wanted to identify with the florality in here. There's a little bit more of that generic florality in a citric direction, so a citric floral component to it. And that's why it's as high as it is, but definitely quite floral for the cup. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, even with as much as I've been mentioning the lime aspect to the cup, this is the one that dominated the majority of the time drinking it. Right there at that level 4. Don't have too much to say on that. Quite pronounced a lot of the time as well. And then the stone fruit level 4, I know that that's a little bit generous. I know that they have some sort of stone fruit note listed on here, and I could feel it. It was a little bit more in the brightness and the acidity, and that was kind of slightly contrasting to the lime. I feel like it was on a really good day if it scored all the way up here to level 4, because right now I'd probably bump that down to a level 3. I think I just kind of wanted to highlight that it was a little bit more pronounced for me than what was a red berry aspect, typically associated with Costa Rican coffees that scored this one a level 3 in terms of the berry fruit. But yeah, I think I just kind of wanted to differentiate between those 3 fruit aspects. Body level 2. Yeah, interestingly enough, even with the V60 as the preferred method for this coffee, it didn't have a whole lot of body. I kind of mentioned the coffee was light all around, start to finish. So on the lighter side of things, bitterness at the level 2, that's not even necessarily too strong in this coffee, because while there was a lot of lime, it wasn't necessarily an overly bitter lime. So the citrus wasn't too bitter in this cup. And then the last thing we must discuss, which is the sweetness at a level 3, and that's going to be the one big detracting factor for me about this coffee. Is I went into it expecting a fair bit of sweetness, given what it was, a red honey processed Costa Rican coffee. If anything, I was expecting more sweetness and a little less clarity, but those two things were kind of flipped based off of the expectation. This coffee was a little bit more tame, and especially in terms of the sweetness. So that right there, at no point could I push that higher than a level 3, but with the exception of that, I think, yeah, this is pretty good for what I was getting from this coffee in terms of this tasting wheel. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, it's actually the same as it has been with the other 2 coffees that we had reviewed from Apollon's Gold up to this point, and that's that they're a little too tame and delicate for me, which is kind of funny. I've oftentimes highlighted coffees that may have a little bit too much development for me, and I think I said in those Apollon's Gold reviews that I wanted a little bit more development from their coffees, and I feel the same way going back to this coffee too, because this coffee, it felt like maybe there was a little bit more to it. Wasn't necessarily the easiest coffee to work with, even following their recipe, which, funny enough, is my recipe as well, something I'm very used to brewing. And no matter what sort of adjustments I made, the coffee remained pretty consistent throughout the time, and trying to heighten the sweetness to this cup was a difficult challenge. Trying to heighten a lot of the flavor profiles to this coffee was a little bit of a difficult challenge, as it just continued to come out very light and tame overall. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, that makes for a very simple recommendation. If you do like your very delicate and tame coffees, I feel like Apollon's Gold is a very nice fit for you, because there is some subtle complexity to this coffee. It's not necessarily going to be the most strong, vibrant, or defined flavor profile from start to finish. You can get some very subtle notes here and there. The lime, while it was a little bit more pronounced, it really did seem to kind of dominate the majority of this cup as well. So somebody that does like their more citric components is another way I would point somebody towards this coffee. But I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Apollon's Gold, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Don Oscar El Coyote Villalobos Red Honey Processed Costa Rica from Apollon's Gold. Thank you for watching.